Do you live in a leasehold? Well, if you do, not a freehold, a leasehold, then news coming to you via 5 Live Money's Mark Syred is going to be something you definitely need to focus on. Mark, give us the details. I could have done the details in the preamble, but why? Why should I? Because you're the expert.
Well, apparently, yes. This is a really big subject. So if you're not affected by it, you'll think, how does this work? But essentially, this affects about 750,000 houses across the UK. And if
a lot of new builds as well.
And it's mainly new builds. If you have bought a new build between essentially 2000 and 2018, there was a chance. There was a chance in which, when you bought that house, that you weren't told about who owned the ground the house was bought on. Now, that sounds a bit odd for many people, I imagine, but when you buy a house, generally you buy the house and the ground around it. But there's this sort of weird, archaic British system, or mainly England and Wales system, I might add, that this is where this is affecting, but English and Wales system, old law system, that the ground can be owned by someone else, and therefore you are leasing that ground of which your house is on.
Potentially for 999 years.
Potentially for a very long time. And the person who might be owning that can sell that bit of paper that you've agreed to pay money towards to keep your house on that bit of ground. They can sell it on and on and on. And this has created quite an enormous amount of stress for 750,000 homeowners. It's really upsetting. It is a scandal in many ways because of how, very much like the PPI, the mis-selling, it was mis-sold at the start. Now, many of the houses that were bought under this, there wasn't necessarily a solicitor involved because it was a new build, all of those sorts of expensive elements of house purchasing and things like that. That was like the developers would say, don't worry, we'll get our legal team on it and they'll sort it for you. And essentially, lots of developers ended up with owning these bits of ground the houses were built on, and then they have sold them off. Last year, 2019, in fact, the CMA, the Competition and Markets Authority, who are a regulator in this area, looked at this under consumer law, because at the moment the government haven't legislated on this specifically, but under consumer law they looked at it and they said, have these people that have bought these houses not really known exactly what they are buying? And since then, the Competition and Market Authority has looked at this. Now, you can imagine, with all these houses and how many times you can actually sell this sort of product on as an investment product, i.e. the leasehold on, that it is quite complicated. But today, they made a ruling, which is the second one. They made the first ruling back in September of 2020. This is the second one. And they have basically looked at property developers. And they said to Persimmon, huge developer, massive FTSE 100 company, and they have agreed with Persimmon that if you had bought a house with them and they owned the freehold, you had the right to buy it back for £2,000, which was as it should have been at the time, but it might not have been communicated when you bought the house. So they have said, Persimmon have agreed to this. Now, one of the businesses that have bought up many of the leases is Aviva. They've bought up, I think, about sort of 1 or 2% of these leases, which is a lot in themselves. And now what happened with the leases was that after like 10 years, the lease was renegotiated and essentially could double or treble, go up dramatically. Yes. So all of a sudden you're paying £400 a year, and then all of a sudden you're paying £800 a year, or if not more. And so the regulator has spoken to Aviva, and they have agreed that they will make sure that none of the leases that were sold, which was Aviva has said is a small percentage, will now no longer double. However, this is a small element within the market because this affects many, many people.
It's interesting. When we moved up here in 2016, we were told by the solicitor, oh, I know it's a big thing in the southeast to have freeholds, but, we don't really worry about it. We're not as obsessed with freeholds up here, so it's fine. You have the leasehold. It doesn't matter. It's 999 years. It doesn't. And my wife was having none of it. It was her. She just went, no, we're having the freehold. And that's what we did in 2016. And
that's really good of your wife to work that out and know that. Bizarrely, this is very much a phenomenon that 61% of these houses that were sold without the freehold was in the northwest. Over 3/4 of them were sold in the north of England. It's a really weird phenomenon. I don't quite understand why that's happened. There's no explanation around that. It's not like there's certain builders up in the north of England that don't build in the south of England. this is just, it's a really weird phenomenon. I don't quite understand that. But the fact of the matter is that many of these people who have bought houses, and you'll have seen many about it, who people have been locked into agreements that the land that their house sits on, they are having to pay large amounts of money for. Now, just to kind of clarify, many people think, yes, but when I moved on to a development, I'm paying for a lot of the shared services. This is not the same. If you move on to a development and your roads aren't adopted by the council or something like that, you pay a fee for that. Everyone agrees to that. But this is about the ground that your house sits on.
Interesting. Joe Darbyshire is with us. Originally had a doubling ground rent with another developer, Taylor Wimpey. Joe, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Now, as also co-founder of the National Leasehold Campaign, I can imagine you're happy with caveats, I can imagine.
Absolutely. I'm delighted that Persimmon have taken the step to sort out partly right the wrongs of the leasehold scandal that they've been involved in, and that Aviva have recognised how onerous these doubling ground rents are and have similarly taken steps as a freeholder to remove them.
So then the question is, what's next? Because there are, of course, many other people in this market, aren't there?
There are. Obviously, my own property was sold to me from Taylor Wimpey. At the time, they told me it was leasehold. They told me the ground rent doubled every 10 years. They also told me that I could buy the freehold at any time for £5,000. And less than 2 years later, they sold the freehold onto Adriatic Land, and the cost went from £5,000 to £50,000 overnight. So, for me, what I'd like to see is that Taylor Wimpey and Adriatic Land, my developer and my freeholder, follow the lead of Aviva and Persimmon, and put me back in the position that I should have been in at the time we bought the house.
Mark, does this put other people such as Taylor Wimpey in an untenable position in many ways?
So Taylor Wimpey have agreed. They were one of the people to agree to many of the regulations that Persimmon has agreed today, and they agreed back in September. The thing about it is, and Joe's highlights this absolutely superbly here, a number of the developers had the freehold and then they just sold it on to all sorts of investment firms that, this is a very good pension product, for example, because, as Joe says, it gives you a ground rent, it gives you an income over a very long time, and you can increase, if you want to buy it back, you can increase that. So it does. So that is a real element. And I think that's sort of Joe's situation there just really highlights the complexity about what the CMA are trying to do, because they can talk to Aviva, they can talk to Persimmon and Taylor Wimpey and all these big companies that have been highlighted in the investigation thus far. But the real regulation would have to come from the government to ensure that what's happened to Joe there would not be happening to other people.
What's next, Joe, as far as you're concerned?
For me, I really do hope that the proactive action of Aviva and Persimmon have taken shames the others into doing something. My experience to date, campaigning against this for the last 4.5 years is that they'll do the minimum they think they can get away with. So it would be nice if this is the first domino to fall and it knocks the rest over, and that those in the housing sector that have been responsible for this scandal put it right.
How easy, Mark, is it to discover whether the people you're thinking of buying a house from have agreed with what the CMA has said?
Well, you should have a document to say who you're paying your ground rent to. And at that point, then you should be able to say, it would be incumbent on them to write to them and say, the CMA have ruled on this. Therefore, I would expect the same sorts of things. They at that point, they're obliged, because the CMA will have to do an investigation and make a ruling. I mean, with Taylor Wimpey, for example, just to give you an example, they have put aside £130 million over this. Aside, very much like when we heard about PPI and mis-selling and things like that, they've put money aside to try and rectify this problem. Now, Taylor Wimpey do make a huge amount of money, and you could say, and many people in Joe's situation would say, well, actually, they would need to put more aside to rectify this problem because of just what's happened. But the complexity of what the company that has bought the ground rent from Joe, from Taylor Wimpey in Joe's case, they will say, well, it's our product, we can do what we want with it, we've paid for it. And that is where the real complication, the expense comes, and the only people that can really rule on that is the government.
Taylor Wimpey have said, we will continue to engage with the CMA and, as previously announced, we will work with them to find a satisfactory solution. Now, Joe, with all the money that you've spent then on this, What would you like to happen in your own personal situation then?
Really simply, I'd like Taylor Wimpey to allow me to buy the freehold for the £5,000 they told me it would be when we bought the property, and I'd like a refund from the freeholder for the ground rent that we paid over and above the original 295, which would put us in the same position as those Aviva freeholders are now going to be in.
Which is where, Joe, as Mark points out, it begins to get a bit complicated.
Yes, absolutely. Because obviously Taylor Wimpey sold the freehold on to the lease to the freeholder. They clearly do have some kind of relationship behind the scenes, because they had a scheme a couple of years ago to allow people who had doublers to convert to RPI. But that's not the answer. As today's announcement clearly shows. I'm really pleased that Aviva have not just removed the escalation terms on those that have still got doubling ground rent, but also on those that originally bought a doubler and have since converted it to RPI.
How long have you been campaigning for this, Joe?
4.5 years, yes. There's three of us ladies that run this campaign alongside our busy day jobs, and we've got around 22,000 people in our Facebook group.
And as Mark pointed out, Mark, again, how many leaseholders are there?
There's around about 750,000, 778,000 of the homeowners are affected. And at the moment, the only bit of legislation that the CMA can actually use to say that you are in contravention of it, such as in the case of Joe, is the Consumer Protection and Unfair Trading Regulation of 2008, which kind of like just basically says that when you bought this product, it wasn't made clear to you some of the implications within it. I mean, that's essentially it. And actually, really, to rectify the problem of that complexity of one company selling on the ground rent to another, that would need government legislation.
Joe, are you aware of the geographical disparities in this, as Mark was pointing out about the percentage in the northwest and the north of England?
Yes, it's certainly where the leasehold scandal took hold. I mean, all three of us that run the National Leasehold Campaign bought leasehold properties in the northwest. And it certainly got to the point where if you were looking at a new build in the northwest sort of 10 years ago, you couldn't find a property that wasn't leasehold. All new estates were built that way.
But with an option to buy, because it's interesting that we were given advice not to buy the freehold, which thankfully my wife ignored.
Yes.
But we were given advice from our own legal advisor, a solicitor, literally like, oh, why are you bothering? You don't need to. Doesn't matter.
Yeah. There's so much education needs to go on. I mean, we were probably the same as you. We used a solicitor that was on the developers panel, and therefore, you've got to question whether they've got a conflict of interest. But also, I found out, that I actually don't own the house. I don't own a brick. What I own is the right to live in the property for the term of the lease. If that lease runs out, I have to hand the keys and everything back to the freeholder. So it's, I think that's one of the reasons why the Commons Select Committee, preferred that leasehold was renamed lease rental, so that those of us who actually think we're, in the home ownership world, we're actually in a lease ownership world.
But when you're given a number like 999 years, people just think, oh, well, I'm definitely not going to be around then. So perhaps they take rather a relaxed attitude towards it when it's given these huge numbers.
I think that's true, but what we've seen in recent years is particularly for flats being sold with very short leases, like 99 years, and as soon as your lease term gets below 80 years, you're then into even more complexities around what it costs to extend a lease in a flat, and it's horrifically expensive.
Yes, very, very expensive, very expensive indeed. Joe, thank you very much for joining us today. Where can people find out more about the National Leasehold Campaign?
Facebook, National Leasehold Campaign. Yeah, you'll find us. There's an open page and there's a closed group that people can request to join.
Perfect. Joe, thanks for joining us today.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Joe Darbyshire there, as she said, from the National Leasehold Campaign.